Today, I'm going to share 3 true stories where the facts in these stories are so bizarre, people today are still trying to explain them. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. Around 8 p.m. on April 25th, 1977, a 31-year-old man named Apolinario Souza Correa poured water on the campfire that he had built with his 3 brothers, Firmino, Aleriano, and Jose, on the beach of a small, uninhabited island in northeast Brazil. The island was called Crab Island, and Apolinario and his family would take their boat there all the time because they would harvest lumber that they would then sell to local construction workers. Now, when they would go out to Crab Island, pretty much every single time, there was nobody else on this island. It was all theirs. But there was a specific reason for that. It was because most of their neighbors thought that Crab Island was haunted. People who visited the island would often report hearing these strange voices coming from the forest, in particular at night, even though nobody lived on this island. And sometimes people even saw lights flashing over the treetops. But Apolinario and his brothers made really good money by going out to Crab Island, and also they just were not afraid of the stories people told. They thought they were all made up. And so today, they had arrived at Crab Island during high tide, which had been at about 12 p.m., and then they had spent the entire afternoon chopping down trees. But that didn't concern them, because they really hadn't planned to immediately sail back home. They had planned to actually have dinner on the island after they were done working, and then maybe sleep for a few hours actually on their boat while it was out on the mud. And then while they were sleeping for a few hours, the tide would come back in again. It would raise their boat up. They would wake up, and they'd be ready to sail home at that point. And so that's what they did. They had this long day of work. They had their dinner by the campfire. And then after Apolinario put out the fire, he and his brothers waded into the mud over towards their boat, which was literally sitting, low tide on the mud. And they climbed on board. They walked into the main cabin. They laid down their sleeping pads. And it didn't take long for them all to fall asleep. Now, Apolinario and his brothers had only intended to sleep until about midnight. But when Apolinario woke back up again, although it was still dark in the cabin, he looked out the tiny window and he saw that the sky outside was already pink from the sunrise. And when he saw this, he groaned because he knew they had overslept and had missed high tide. Basically, their boat had gone back up and then back down into the mud, and now they were stuck again and would have to wait likely until noon to finally be able to leave. So it was just a nuisance. And so at this point, Apolinario looked over to see if his 3 brothers were still asleep. And he saw that Firmino and Jose were still asleep on their sleeping pads with their blankets pulled up over their faces. But his 3rd brother, Aleriano, his sleeping pad was empty and he wasn't inside the cabin. And so as Apolinario is realizing, his 3rd brother is gone, doesn't know where he is, he hears this just deafening screaming coming from outside on the boat, but not inside the main cabin. And so immediately Apolinario, he jumps up, he runs outside, and he finds his 3rd brother, Aleriano. And his brother was completely covered in burns. Apolinario was so horrified that he just froze because it looked like his brother's skin had literally been set on fire. And then he noticed something even stranger about the whole thing, which was, his brother, despite being so badly burned, his clothes didn't appear burned. It was like literally just his skin. Like somehow his skin had caught fire, but nothing else on him. And his brother is just screaming in agony, and Apolinario has no idea what to do. He has no idea how this even happened. And while this is happening, this sort of shocked moment, Apolinario begins to hear moaning coming from back inside the cabin where he came from. And so just sort of acting on instinct, he ran back inside the cabin. And remember, his 2 brothers, Firmino and Jose, their blankets were up over their heads, so he hadn't seen them yet. And so he runs in, he knows the moaning is coming from one of them, and he pulls back the blankets, and he sees the moaning is coming from Firmino, and his skin is just horribly burned. Like his skin is literally falling off his body, but just like his other brother, his clothes didn't appear to be burned at all. It was like just his skin had been set on fire, and he's moaning in just pure agony. And then Apolinario, he looks over at his other brother, who's also on his sleeping pad, Jose, and he was not burned, but he was dead. Now, unfortunately, because of the tides, Apollinario still had to wait a full 6 hours before he could get his brothers off the island. So he waited until the tide came in, and then finally they took off. And then when they got back to land, Oleriano, who was the one who was screaming outside the main cabin, who had, burns all over his body, he was badly hurt, but not maybe critically so. He stayed behind with Jose's body, and Apollinario wound up taking Firmino to the hospital because his injuries looked like they could be critical. When they finally got to the hospital, Firmino was barely conscious. His injuries were really taking a toll on him. It was like his body was shutting down. But as soon as he was checked in, the doctors asked him, hey, just tell us how you got these burns. Give us some indication of how this happened. Right before Firmino slipped into a coma from his burns, he was able to tell them that when he and his brothers were still out at Crab Island, he had looked out the window from inside the cabin of his boat when they were all sleeping in the boat, and outside there was this inexplicable ball of fire hovering in the air. And that's all he remembered. He had no idea how he actually got burned. So the police opened an investigation into whatever happened that night at Crab Island, and they would come up with several theories that, maybe could explain it, including that maybe the men had simply injured each other and were just sort of lying about it. Maybe they had taken drugs or were under the influence of something, and while being that way, they could have hurt themselves or each other, or just something could have happened that they didn't remember. Or another theory was maybe lightning struck the beach and somehow reflected off the sand, and bolts of lightning made their way out into the boat and, burned two and killed one. But the reality is these theories, there was no evidence to support any of them. In fact, the big takeaway from this investigation is basically that when they went out to that island, they found nothing. There was just no evidence whatsoever. Ultimately, the two injured surviving brothers, Firmino and Oleriano, they would make full recoveries, but neither of them ever could remember any meaningful details of what happened. And so eventually the case was closed without really any answers. But strange stories continued to come from Crab Island. People continued to hear voices and see strange lights. And finally, in April of 1986, so 9 years after the death of Jose, a different crew of 4 men traveled out to Crab Island to harvest timber. And at some point, they all recalled hearing this loud crashing sound out in the woods, and then they all just fell unconscious. And when they woke up again, it was 18 hours later. One of them was dead, and another one was inexplicably covered in burns. And just like the brothers 9 years earlier, the survivors of this incident had no memory of what happened.